Now, let's dive into today's story. Some betrayals cut so deep they change the very fabric of who you are. And the Sunday my 9-year-old son Tommy shattered my world with 6 simple words, I felt something fundamental break inside me that would never heal the same way again. "Daddy, Grandma isn't dead," he said, his innocent eyes wide with confusion as he stood in our kitchen, still wearing his Sunday clothes from what I thought was another solemn visit to the cemetery where my mother-in-law had been laid to rest 3 years ago. I'd always been the kind of man who prided himself on control, on seeing through people's lies and motivations. It's what made me successful in commercial construction, where reading between the lines of contracts and sussing out unreliable subcontractors meant the difference between profit and bankruptcy. My father raised me in the ruins of his own failed business, constantly reminding me that trust was a luxury we couldn't afford, that every handshake needed to be backed by ironclad agreements, and that weakness in business or personal relationships was an invitation for others to destroy you. When I met Lisa 8 years ago at a charity auction where she was organizing silent bids for a local children's hospital, her warm laugh and seemingly genuine compassion had been the first things to crack through the careful walls I'd built around myself. And I'd convinced myself that her transparency and kindness meant she was different from the calculating people I dealt with daily. Our courtship had been a whirlwind of romantic dinners and long conversations about building something meaningful together. And when she'd introduced me to Tommy, then barely 2 years old, and calling me Derek with a shy smile, I'd felt something I'd never experienced before, the desire to protect and provide for a family that felt genuinely mine. Lisa had been vague about Tommy's father, mentioning only that he'd been absent since before Tommy's birth, and that she'd moved to our town to start fresh. And I'd respected her privacy, while secretly feeling grateful that another man's failure had led to my happiness. We'd married in a small ceremony 18 months later, with Tommy serving as our enthusiastic ring bearer, and I'd legally adopted him within the year, giving him my last name and promising Lisa that he'd never want for anything as long as I was breathing. The first few years of our marriage had been everything I'd hoped for. Lisa's genuine affection for my work stories, her encouragement when I landed the contract to build the new municipal complex, her easy laughter when I came home covered in sawdust and cement. She'd seamlessly integrated into my life, befriending my business partner Annie, helping coordinate company barbecues, and transforming our house into something that actually felt like a home rather than just a place where I slept between job sites. When her mother passed away 3 years into our marriage, I'd seen Lisa's grief as proof of her capacity for deep emotional connection, and I'd held her through countless nights of tears while she processed the loss of the woman who'd raised her as a single mother after Lisa's father died in a workplace accident when she was 12. But now, standing in our kitchen with Tommy's words echoing in my ears, I felt the careful foundation of our life together shifting beneath my feet like unstable ground before a building collapse. "What do you mean, buddy?" I asked, keeping my voice steady while my mind raced through possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. "Grandma Helen died 3 years ago, remember? We went to her funeral together." Tommy's face scrunched up in the way it did when he was trying to reconcile conflicting information, his small hands fidgeting with the hem of his dress shirt. "But Mommy takes me to see her every Sunday," he insisted, his voice carrying that particular tone children use when they're absolutely certain about something adults seem to be denying. "She lives in this really scary house with broken windows and lots of cats, and she's really thin and has no teeth. And Mommy always gives her money from her purse, and they talk in whispers, and sometimes Grandma Helen cries." The blood in my veins seemed to slow to ice water as I processed this information, my construction-trained mind automatically organizing details and looking for structural weaknesses in what Tommy was telling me. Lisa had been taking our weekly Sunday drives to what she claimed was her mother's graveside for 3 years, using that time for what she said was private mourning and reflection, and I'd respected her need for space while staying home to prep for the upcoming week's job sites. Every Sunday, she and Tommy would leave around noon in her silver Honda, returning by 4 with Tommy usually quiet and Lisa seeming emotionally drained in a way that I'd attributed to grief but was now starting to recognize might be something entirely different. "Tommy, when you and Mommy go to see Grandma Helen, does she talk to you?" I asked, crouching down to his eye level and fighting to keep my expression neutral while my pulse hammered against my throat. "What kinds of things does she say?" "She mostly talks to Mommy," Tommy replied, his brow furrowed as he accessed memories that were clearly troubling him. "But sometimes she looks at me really hard and asks Mommy questions about school and if I'm being good. And one time she told Mommy that I looked just like someone she used to know, and that made Mommy start crying really hard, and we had to leave early." Every instinct I developed over years of navigating complex business deals and reading people's motivations was now screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with the picture Lisa had painted of our Sunday routines. And I felt that familiar cold calculation settling over me that had served me well when dealing with contractors who tried to shortchange me or competitors who attempted to undercut my bids. "Does this house where Grandma Helen lives have an address, buddy? Could you find it again if we drove around looking for it?" Tommy nodded eagerly, apparently relieved to have someone finally taking his version of events seriously. "It's near that big water tower that looks like a spaceship, past the railroad tracks where all the houses look old and broken," he said, providing landmarks that placed the location in the Mill District, a rundown area on the outskirts of town where property values had never recovered from the textile factory closures in the 90s and where most decent families avoided going unless absolutely necessary. That evening, after Tommy had gone to bed and Lisa was in our master bathroom going through her usual nighttime routine, I sat in my home office staring at the framed photo of our family from last Christmas, trying to reconcile the woman who'd lovingly wrapped Tommy's presents and made my favorite coffee cake with someone who'd been systematically lying to me about something as fundamental as where she spent every Sunday afternoon. Lisa's reflection in the bathroom mirror showed the same face I'd been waking up next to for 5 years. But now I found myself studying her expressions differently, looking for signs of deception I might have missed, cataloging small inconsistencies in her stories that I'd previously dismissed as the natural variations in anyone's recollections. When she emerged from the bathroom in her familiar blue cotton pajamas, her dark hair pulled back in the ponytail she always wore to bed, I felt a strange disconnection from the domestic scene we'd enacted thousands of times before. "How was Tommy today?" she asked, settling onto her side of our king-size bed with the same easy familiarity that had once felt comforting but now seemed almost performance-like. "He seemed quieter than usual after we got back from visiting Mom." The word Mom hit me like a physical blow, and I had to use every ounce of self-control I possessed to keep my voice level and casual. "He mentioned something interesting about Grandma Helen," I said, watching Lisa's face carefully for any telltale signs of panic or defensiveness. "Said she lives in a house near the water tower instead of being buried in the cemetery." For just a fraction of a second, Lisa's entire body went rigid in a way that reminded me of how subcontractors looked when they realized they'd been caught falsifying invoices, but she recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that sounded just slightly off-key to my newly suspicious ears. "You know how kids mix up reality and imagination," she said, but her hands were fidgeting with the bedsheet in a nervous gesture I'd never noticed before. "He's been watching too many of those ghost movies at Annie's house when we have our poker nights. I should talk to her about what she lets him see." But I'd built my entire career on the ability to spot when people were feeding me lines instead of truth, and everything about Lisa's response felt rehearsed and deflective in a way that made my chest tighten with a combination of rage and something deeper that I wasn't ready to name yet. "Maybe I should come with you next Sunday," I suggested, keeping my tone light and supportive. "I know you like having that private time with your mom, but it might be good for Tommy to see us both honoring her memory together." The color drained from Lisa's face so quickly that she might as well have confessed outright, and when she spoke, her voice carried an edge of desperation that she was trying unsuccessfully to disguise as casual concern. "Oh, Derek, you don't want to spend your only free day sitting in a depressing cemetery," she said, reaching over to touch my arm in what felt more like a restraint than affection. "Besides, it's really more about giving Tommy a sense of connection to his grandmother's memory, and you never really knew Mom well enough for it to be meaningful for you." The dismissal stung more than it should have, particularly since I'd spent considerable time and effort getting to know Helen before her death, helping her with home repairs and taking her to medical appointments when Lisa was overwhelmed with Tommy's schedule. But more importantly, Lisa's desperation to keep me away from these Sunday excursions had confirmed what my gut was already telling me. Whatever she was doing during those 4-hour absences had nothing to do with honoring her dead mother and everything to do with maintaining a deception that was apparently crucial enough to lie to her husband and involve our son in the process. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Lisa's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, my mind working through the logistics of what I needed to discover and how I was going to go about getting the truth without alerting Lisa to my suspicions. The Mill District wasn't large, and a house matching Tommy's description near the water tower would be relatively easy to locate. But I needed to be strategic about my approach because something told me that whatever I was going to find would require careful planning and absolute proof before I could decide how to respond. In the construction business, you learned early that demolition without a clear rebuilding plan was just expensive destruction, and whatever was about to happen to my family was going to require the same kind of methodical approach I used when taking down unstable structures that needed to be replaced with something stronger. The next morning, I called Annie to ask if she could handle the site supervision for our current strip mall project, citing a family matter that needed my attention, and by 10 a.m. I was driving through the Mill District with Tommy's landmarks fresh in my memory and a growing sense of dread about what I was going to discover. The area was even more depressing in daylight than I'd remembered, with abandoned lots overgrown with weeds, houses that looked like they were held together by peeling paint and stubborn hope, and the kind of atmosphere that made you check your car doors were locked even when you were just driving through. I found the house on Maple Street, a sagging 2-story structure with broken porch railings and windows covered by what looked like old bedsheets, surrounded by at least a dozen cats of various sizes and colors that scattered when I parked across the street. The yard was littered with empty food cans and makeshift shelters constructed from cardboard boxes and plastic tarps, and the whole property had the air of neglect and desperation that made my skin crawl with a combination of pity and revulsion. This was where my wife had been bringing our son every Sunday for 3 years, and as I sat in my truck trying to process the implications of that fact, I felt something cold and calculating settle in my chest that I recognized as the same feeling I got when competitors tried to sabotage my job sites or steal my clients. As I watched the house, the front door opened and a woman emerged who matched Tommy's description perfectly. Painfully thin, missing most of her teeth, wearing clothes that had seen better decades, and moving with the careful shuffle of someone whose body had been broken by years of hard living. But what stopped my breath entirely was the moment she turned toward the street, and I saw her face clearly for the first time, because this wasn't some random homeless woman or drug addict that Lisa had been inexplicably supporting with our family's money. This was Helen Martinez, my supposedly dead mother-in-law, alive and apparently living in conditions that made me understand why Lisa might want the world to believe she was dead. The revelation hit me like a sledgehammer to the solar plexus, and I had to grip the steering wheel to keep my hands from shaking as the full scope of Lisa's deception began to crystallize in my mind. For 3 years, she'd been lying about her mother's death, accepting sympathy and condolences from friends and neighbors while secretly maintaining a relationship that she'd deemed too shameful or complicated to share with her own husband. She'd involved our son in this elaborate charade, taken flowers to a fake grave site, and allowed me to comfort her through what I believed was genuine grief while she was actually dealing with whatever circumstances had led to her mother living in this nightmare scenario. But as I sat there watching Helen tend to her collection of stray cats with the kind of focused attention that suggested this was the most meaningful part of her day, I realized that discovering the lie was only the beginning of a much larger problem, because Lisa's willingness to maintain such an elaborate deception meant that either she didn't trust me enough to share whatever crisis had led to this situation, or there were aspects of her mother's circumstances that were so problematic she'd chosen to fake a death rather than deal with them honestly. Either way, the foundation of our marriage had just revealed a crack so fundamental that I wasn't sure it could be repaired, and the cold rage building in my chest told me that maybe I didn't want to repair it so much as I wanted to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went before I decided what to do about it. The next 3 weeks passed in a surreal haze of enforced normalcy while I conducted what felt like a surveillance operation on my own life, carefully documenting Lisa's Sunday routines while maintaining the facade of a trusting husband who had no reason to question his wife's weekly cemetery visits. I'd positioned myself in the Mill District every Sunday since my initial discovery, watching from various vantage points as Lisa's Honda pulled up to the decrepit house on Maple Street and noting the interactions between her, Tommy, and the woman I now knew was her very much alive mother. What I observed painted a picture even more disturbing than I'd initially imagined, because these weren't brief obligation visits, but intensive 3-hour sessions that involved Lisa carrying bags of groceries and supplies into the house, sometimes emerging with laundry that she'd apparently been handling for her mother, and engaging in what looked like heated conversations that often left both women visibly upset. Tommy spent most of these visits sitting on the porch steps playing with the cats, occasionally running inside when called, but clearly more comfortable outside the house itself. And the whole dynamic had the feel of a family crisis being managed in secret rather than simple charitable support for an impoverished relative. During one particularly revealing Sunday, I'd watched through binoculars as a man emerged from the house mid-visit, someone I'd never seen before, but who clearly knew both Lisa and Tommy well enough to engage them in animated conversation before disappearing back inside with Lisa following him while Tommy remained on the porch with strict instructions not to move. That man's presence had shifted my understanding of the situation entirely, because Helen living alone in squalor was one kind of problem, but Helen living with an unknown man while my wife made secret visits and payments suggested complications that went far beyond family embarrassment or financial hardship. I'd started my own investigation into Helen's supposed death, beginning with the funeral home that had supposedly handled her services and discovering that while they had indeed filed death certificates and handled arrangements for Helen Martinez 3 years ago, the woman buried in Maplewood Cemetery under that name was actually an indigent Jane Doe whose body had been unclaimed for over 6 months before Lisa arranged for burial. The funeral director, a soft-spoken man named Reynolds who'd been in the business for 30 years, had explained the arrangement as a charitable gesture by a grieving daughter who wanted to ensure a proper burial for someone who'd died alone, and he'd praised Lisa's compassion in such a way that made it clear he had no idea he'd been participating in an elaborate fraud. The cemetery records showed that Lisa had indeed been making regular visits to the grave site, apparently maintaining her cover story even when she thought no one would verify her activities, and the groundskeeper mentioned that she always brought fresh flowers and spent at least an hour in what appeared to be genuine mourning. The level of detail Lisa had put into maintaining this deception was staggering, and it spoke to a capacity for long-term planning and emotional manipulation that made me question everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd married. My investigation into Helen's actual circumstances led me through county records and property databases until I discovered that the house on Maple Street was owned by Curtis Brennan, a 53-year-old man whose background check revealed a history that made my blood run cold. Curtis had spent 8 years in state prison for aggravated assault and sexual battery, with a particular pattern of targeting vulnerable women who were dealing with addiction or mental health issues. And his most recent conviction had been overturned on a technicality just 6 months before Helen's supposed death. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture that made me physically sick, because it was becoming clear that Helen hadn't simply fallen on hard times or chosen to live in poverty, but was being controlled by a predator who'd somehow gained influence over her around the same time Lisa had decided the world needed to believe her mother was dead. The timing suggested that Lisa had known about Curtis and had made a calculated decision to protect her own reputation and social standing rather than find a way to actually help her mother escape whatever hold he had over her. But the revelation that truly shattered what remained of my faith in Lisa came when I hired a private investigator named Rodriguez to dig deeper into the connections between all the parties involved. Rodriguez was a former police detective who specialized in domestic cases, and within a week he'd uncovered records showing that Curtis Brennan had been in contact with Lisa for over 4 years, including phone calls and meetings that predated her mother's supposed death by almost 8 months. More damaging still, bank records showed that Lisa had been making regular cash withdrawals of $300 to $500 every month, amounts that perfectly matched the timeline of her Sunday visits and suggested that her payments to Curtis weren't emergency support for her mother, but ongoing installments of what looked disturbingly like extortion. The night Rodriguez delivered his preliminary report, I sat in my truck outside our house for almost 2 hours, staring at the warm yellow lights in our kitchen windows and trying to reconcile the evidence of Lisa's deception with the woman who'd kissed me goodbye that morning and reminded me to pick up milk on my way home from the job site. The Lisa I thought I'd married wouldn't have been capable of allowing her mother to live under the control of a convicted predator while paying him regular money to maintain that arrangement. But the evidence was overwhelming that this was exactly what had been happening for years while I'd been building our life together in complete ignorance. When I finally went inside, Lisa was helping Tommy with homework at the kitchen table, both of them looking up with the kind of innocent family tableau that would have warmed my heart just weeks earlier, but now felt like an elaborate performance designed to maintain the illusion of normalcy. "How was your day?" Lisa asked with the same bright smile she'd been giving me for 5 years, and I had to swallow the urge to ask her which version of her day she was planning to share with me this time. "Productive," I replied, settling into my usual chair and watching Tommy work through multiplication problems with the kind of intense focus that reminded me of myself at that age. Annie mentioned that the Patterson project is ahead of schedule, so we might actually finish early and under budget for once. Lisa's laugh sounded genuine, but I was now analyzing every expression and gesture for signs of deception, cataloging the way she avoided direct eye contact when discussing anything related to her daily activities, and noting how quickly she changed subjects whenever I asked about her plans for the upcoming weekend. "That's wonderful," she said, reaching over to squeeze my hand in what felt more like a diversion than affection. "Maybe we can take Tommy to that new arcade in the mall this weekend if you're not completely exhausted from work." But even as she spoke about weekend plans, I noticed Lisa's phone buzzing with text messages that she quickly glanced at before turning the device face down on the table. And when Tommy asked if they were still going to visit Grandma Helen on Sunday, Lisa's response was just a beat too quick and carried an edge of warning that she tried to disguise as maternal guidance. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart," she said, her voice taking on that particular tone adults use when reminding children of secrets they're supposed to keep. "Grandma Helen visits are special time just for us, and Daddy has too much work to worry about family stuff like that." The casual dismissal of my involvement in family stuff hit me like a slap, particularly since I'd been supporting this family financially and emotionally for 5 years while Lisa had been secretly managing a crisis that apparently required weekly payments to a convicted felon. But more disturbing was the realization that she'd been training Tommy to participate in maintaining her deception, teaching him to think of their Sunday activities as something that needed to be hidden from me rather than shared as part of our normal family life. That night, after Lisa had fallen asleep with the same peaceful expression she'd worn every night of our marriage, I called Rodriguez to request expanded surveillance that would include following Lisa and Tommy during their Sunday visits and documenting their interactions with Curtis Brennan. "I need to know exactly what kind of relationship exists between my wife and this man," I told him, "and I need photographs and recordings that will hold up if this situation escalates to legal proceedings." Rodriguez's experience with domestic investigations had apparently prepared him for requests like mine, because he didn't ask unnecessary questions about my motivations or try to talk me out of gathering evidence against my own wife. These kinds of situations usually involve either ongoing extortion, romantic relationships that have gone toxic, or family secrets that one party is using for leverage, he explained in his matter-of-fact way. "Whatever you're dealing with, you'll need complete documentation if you want to protect yourself and your son when this comes to a head." The following Sunday, Rodriguez positioned himself with high-powered surveillance equipment while I maintained my usual distance, and what he captured exceeded even my worst expectations about the nature of Lisa's relationship with Curtis Brennan. The photographs showed Lisa and Curtis embracing with the kind of familiarity that suggested a long-term intimate relationship, and the audio recordings captured conversations that made it clear Curtis wasn't just exploiting Helen for money, but was actively manipulating Lisa through a combination of emotional blackmail and romantic manipulation that had been going on for years. "You know what happens if Derek finds out about any of this?" Curtis's voice came through clearly on the recordings, his tone carrying the kind of casual threat that suggested this was a conversation they'd had many times before. "Helen stays put, you keep bringing the money, and your perfect little family life continues exactly like it has been. But if you start getting ideas about backing out or bringing your husband into this, things are going to get very complicated very quickly for everyone involved." Lisa's response revealed a level of emotional dependence on Curtis that made me understand why she'd been willing to maintain such an elaborate deception rather than simply tell me the truth about her mother's circumstances. "I know, Curtis, I know," she said, her voice carrying a combination of fear and something that sounded disturbingly like affection. "But Derek's starting to ask questions, and Tommy's getting old enough to understand more about what's happening. Maybe it's time to figure out a different arrangement." "The arrangement works fine the way it is," Curtis replied, and the recordings captured the sound of what was clearly a physical interaction between them that lasted several minutes, while Tommy remained outside with Helen. "Your husband's got more money than he knows what to do with, and a few hundred a month is pocket change for someone pulling down the kind of contracts he's been landing. Helen gets taken care of, you get to keep playing happy families, and everyone wins." But the most damaging part of the recording came when Lisa emerged from the house, and I heard her telling Tommy, with practiced ease, about their visit to Grandma Helen's grave, and how important it was to maintain the story they'd been sharing with me for 3 years. "Remember, sweetheart, when Daddy asks about our day, we went to the cemetery and brought flowers and said prayers for Grandma Helen," she coached, her voice carrying the kind of maternal authority that made it clear this wasn't a recent development, but a routine they'd been practicing for years. As I listened to my wife systematically training our son to lie to me about fundamental aspects of their lives, something inside me shifted permanently from the desire to understand and possibly repair our relationship to a cold determination to make sure that Lisa and Curtis Brennan paid the full price for their deception and manipulation. They'd involved my son in their schemes, stolen money from our family to fund whatever twisted relationship they developed, and turned the fundamental trust of marriage into a weapon they'd been using against me for years while I'd been working to build the life I thought we all wanted. The photographs Rodriguez showed me later that week included images of Lisa and Curtis in clearly romantic situations, their body language speaking to an intimacy that had obviously been developing parallel to her marriage to me. And suddenly Lisa's occasional distant moods, her decreased interest in physical intimacy, and her defensive reactions to questions about her daily activities all made perfect sense. She'd been living a double life that included not just deception about her mother's circumstances, but an ongoing affair with the man who was controlling both Helen and, apparently, Lisa herself. That night, I stood in our bedroom watching Lisa sleep and felt something close to hatred for the first time in my adult life, because this wasn't just betrayal, but a systematic campaign of deception that had involved our son, our finances, and the fundamental honesty that I believed was the foundation of our marriage. Lisa had made me complicit in her lies by accepting my comfort during her supposed grief, had stolen from our family to fund her relationship with a convicted predator, and had been training Tommy to participate in maintaining a fiction that served only her selfish desire to avoid dealing with difficult family circumstances. But as I stood there planning my response to discoveries that had shattered everything I believed about my life, I realized that simple confrontation or even divorce wasn't going to be sufficient to address what Lisa and Curtis had done to me and my son. They'd been playing a long game of manipulation and exploitation that had lasted for years, and my response was going to need to be equally strategic and far more decisive than anything they'd be expecting from the trusting husband who'd been funding their scheme without ever suspecting the truth. Curtis Brennan had apparently built his life around preying on vulnerable people and controlling them through fear and manipulation. But he'd never dealt with someone who understood that the most effective revenge required patience, planning, and the willingness to be more ruthless than your enemies expected. The beauty of a well-executed demolition is that the target never sees it coming until the carefully placed charges detonate in perfect sequence, bringing down even the most solid-looking structures in a matter of seconds. And over the next 6 weeks, I applied every lesson I'd learned from controlled building destruction to the systematic dismantling of Lisa and Curtis's lives. My approach required the same meticulous planning I used for major construction projects, identifying load-bearing elements of their operation and determining the precise order in which they needed to be removed to ensure complete structural collapse. My first target was Curtis's living situation, because a convicted felon maintaining control over a vulnerable woman while running what appeared to be an extortion scheme from a residential property represented multiple violations that various authorities would be very interested to investigate. Rodriguez's surveillance had documented Curtis's pattern of hosting other transient individuals at the Maple Street house, apparently running an informal boarding operation that violated both his parole conditions and local housing codes. And it only took a few anonymous tips to the appropriate agencies to trigger inspections that would make his current arrangement untenable. The county health department found numerous violations, including improper sewage disposal, unsafe electrical wiring, and evidence of vermin infestation that resulted in immediate condemnation proceedings, while his parole officer discovered that Curtis had been operating an unlicensed rooming house and maintaining contact with other convicted felons in violation of his supervision requirements. Within 2 weeks, Curtis was facing revocation of his parole and eviction from the only property that had given him leverage over Helen and, by extension, over Lisa. But destroying Curtis's base of operations was only the opening move in a larger strategy designed to eliminate his ability to manipulate and control the people around him. Through Rodriguez's contacts in law enforcement, I learned that Curtis had been suspected of similar extortion schemes involving other vulnerable women, but previous victims had been too intimidated or emotionally dependent to provide the evidence necessary for prosecution. My situation was different because I had financial resources, documentation of his activities, and most importantly, no emotional attachment to Curtis that would prevent me from pursuing him with the kind of relentless focus that had made my construction business successful. The recordings Rodriguez had captured of Curtis threatening Lisa and discussing their financial arrangement provided enough evidence for charges of extortion and conspiracy, but I wanted to ensure that when Curtis fell, he fell completely and permanently. Working with a lawyer who specialized in white-collar crime, I developed a strategy that would simultaneously expose Curtis's criminal activities and Lisa's complicity while protecting Tommy from the worst consequences of their actions. Lisa's first indication that her carefully constructed world was starting to collapse came when Curtis called her in a panic about the housing inspections and parole violations, a conversation I was able to monitor through the phone surveillance Rodriguez had legally installed with court approval based on the evidence we'd already gathered. "Someone's been watching us," Curtis told her, his voice carrying the kind of desperation I recognized from contractors who'd been caught falsifying inspection reports. The health department knew exactly where to look for violations, and my parole officer had photographs of people coming and going from the house. "This isn't random enforcement, Lisa. Someone with resources and connections has been building a case." Lisa's response revealed the depth of her emotional dependence on Curtis and her willingness to prioritize their relationship over her family's stability. "Maybe Derek's getting suspicious," she suggested, but her tone carried more concern for Curtis's welfare than recognition of the danger her deception had created for Tommy and herself. "He's been asking more questions lately, and he's got connections with city contractors who might know people in the inspection departments." But Curtis's next words made it clear that their relationship involved dynamics even more disturbing than simple adultery and financial exploitation. "If your husband's onto us, then we need to accelerate our timeline," he said, his voice taking on the calculating tone I'd heard him use when manipulating Helen. "The retirement account you've been promising access to, the life insurance policies, the house deed. We can't wait for natural opportunity anymore. Sometimes you have to create your own windows of opportunity, if you understand what I'm saying." The implications of Curtis's statement hit me like a physical blow, because he wasn't just discussing financial fraud, but apparently encouraging Lisa to consider scenarios that would give them complete access to our family's assets. And the most obvious way to achieve that goal would be through my death or incapacitation. Lisa's response wasn't immediate horror at the suggestion, but a nervous discussion of logistics, practical concerns about timing and methods that made it clear this wasn't the first time they discussed the possibility of eliminating me as an obstacle to their plans. "Derek's got that big commercial project starting next month," Lisa said, her voice carrying the kind of clinical detachment that suggested she'd moved far beyond viewing me as her husband and was now seeing me primarily as a problem to be solved. "Construction sites have accidents all the time, and with all the heavy equipment and structural work, it would be easy to arrange something that looked completely natural. His life insurance alone would set us up permanently, and with him gone, there wouldn't be anyone questioning where I go on Sundays or how I spend money." As I listened to my wife casually discussing my murder with her lover, the last remnants of whatever emotional attachment I'd felt for her evaporated completely, replaced by the kind of cold fury that made every decision crystal clear. Lisa hadn't just betrayed our marriage or stolen money or lied about her mother's circumstances. She'd been actively planning my death while sleeping next to me every night and kissing me goodbye every morning, using the intimacy of our relationship to gather information about my schedule and routines that would help Curtis arrange an accident at one of my job sites. The recording of that conversation became the centerpiece of my case against both of them, but I wasn't content to simply turn the evidence over to police and hope that the legal system would provide adequate justice for what they'd planned to do to me and Tommy. Curtis Brennan had built his life around preying on people he perceived as weaker or more vulnerable than himself, and I was going to demonstrate that he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment about my capacity for retaliation. My response began with a coordinated series of actions designed to systematically destroy every source of power and control Curtis had developed over the years while ensuring that Lisa faced consequences that matched the scope of her betrayal. Using the same network of contractors and city officials that had helped build my business, I arranged for intensive investigation of every property Curtis had been associated with, every business relationship he'd developed, and every person who might have been victimized by his manipulative tactics. The results exceeded even my expectations for thoroughness, because Curtis's predatory behavior had apparently affected dozens of vulnerable individuals over the years, and when presented with evidence of his activities and encouragement to come forward, many of his previous victims were eager to provide testimony that painted a picture of systematic abuse and exploitation spanning more than a decade. The district attorney's office suddenly found themselves with enough evidence to pursue multiple felony charges that would ensure Curtis spent the rest of his functional life in prison. But while the legal system was building its case against Curtis, I was implementing a more immediate and personal form of justice that would address the specific ways he'd threatened my family. Rodriguez's surveillance had identified Curtis's daily routines, his favorite locations, and the people he interacted with regularly, and I used that information to orchestrate encounters that would demonstrate my willingness to respond to his threats with escalating levels of physical consequence. The first confrontation occurred at a convenience store near the Maple Street house, where I approached Curtis while he was purchasing cigarettes and calmly informed him that I was aware of his activities, his relationship with my wife, and his plans for my elimination. "You made a mistake when you involved my son in your schemes," I told him, speaking quietly enough that other customers couldn't overhear, but clearly enough that Curtis understood exactly what kind of danger he was facing. "And you made an even bigger mistake when you started planning my death, because now I have to decide whether to let the legal system handle you or take care of this problem myself." Curtis's response revealed the kind of cowardice that often lurks beneath the surface of predatory behavior, because when confronted by someone who wasn't vulnerable or afraid, his threatening demeanor immediately shifted to defensive panic. "I don't know what you think you heard," he stammered, backing away from me despite his size advantage, "but you're making accusations that could get you in serious legal trouble." But I'd moved far beyond concern about legal trouble, and I wanted Curtis to understand that his usual tactics of intimidation and manipulation weren't going to work on someone who'd already decided that protecting my son justified whatever consequences might result from my actions. "The legal trouble is already handled," I replied, pulling out copies of the recordings and photographs Rodriguez had gathered. "The district attorney has enough evidence to put you away for the rest of your life, and my wife's cooperation with their investigation is going to ensure that happens whether she wants to help them or not." The fear in Curtis's eyes when he realized the scope of the evidence against him was satisfying, but I wasn't finished with the message I needed him to understand about the consequences of threatening my family. "But here's what the legal system can't provide," I continued, stepping closer until Curtis was pressed against the cigarette display behind him. "If you make any attempt to contact my wife, my son, or anyone else in my family before your trial, if you try to run or hide or interfere with the prosecution's case in any way, I'm going to track you down and demonstrate exactly why smart predators don't target construction workers who know how to make problems disappear permanently." The next phase of my strategy involved ensuring that Lisa faced consequences that extended beyond whatever legal penalties she might receive for her involvement in Curtis's activities. Marriage is fundamentally a contract, and Lisa had violated every significant provision of our agreement while using my resources to fund her betrayal and plan my elimination, which meant that her financial future was going to be very different from what she'd been expecting when she and Curtis discussed accessing my life insurance and retirement accounts. Working with a divorce attorney who specialized in cases involving adultery and financial fraud, I documented every aspect of Lisa's deception and began proceedings that would ensure she received nothing beyond what the law required for basic child support. The prenuptial agreement we'd signed before marriage included specific provisions for adultery and criminal activity, conditions that Lisa had apparently forgotten about when she was planning her future with Curtis, and those clauses were going to cost her dearly when we divided our assets. More importantly, I was pursuing full custody of Tommy based on Lisa's willingness to involve him in maintaining her deception and her demonstrated poor judgment in exposing him to Curtis and the dangerous environment of the Maple Street house. Child Protective Services became very interested in Lisa's parenting decisions when presented with evidence that she'd been taking a 9-year-old boy to regular meetings with a convicted felon who was actively planning crimes, and their investigation provided additional leverage in ensuring that Tommy's future would be protected from his mother's destructive choices. The final confrontation with Lisa occurred on a Thursday evening when she returned from what I now knew was a meeting with Curtis to discuss their deteriorating situation and their options for salvaging their relationship despite the legal pressures mounting against them. She walked into our kitchen with the same casual familiarity she'd displayed for 5 years, apparently still believing that her ability to maintain surface normalcy would protect her from consequences for her actions. "We need to talk," I said, gesturing for her to sit at the table where Tommy had revealed the truth about her Sunday activities just 2 months earlier. "About your mother, about Curtis Brennan, about the money you've been stealing from our family, and about the plans you've been making for my death." The color drained from Lisa's face as she realized that her carefully constructed deception had collapsed completely. But even in that moment of revelation, her first instinct was to attempt manipulation rather than honesty. "Derek, I can explain everything," she began, reaching across the table toward me with the same gestures of affection she'd been using to distract me from her lies for years. "The situation with my mother is complicated, and Curtis has been helping us manage a crisis that I didn't know how to handle alone." But I was no longer the trusting husband who'd accepted her explanations without verification, and Lisa's attempt to maintain her victim narrative only reinforced my determination to ensure she faced full consequences for her choices. "I've heard the recordings of you discussing how to arrange my death so you and Curtis could access my life insurance," I replied, placing copies of the surveillance evidence on the table between us. "I've seen the photographs of you with your lover while you were supposedly mourning your dead mother. I know about the money, the lies, the manipulation, and the plans you made to eliminate me when I became inconvenient to your new life." Lisa's facade finally cracked completely as she realized that denial was no longer possible, and her response revealed the depth of her selfishness and her complete lack of remorse for the damage she'd caused to our family. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under," she said, her voice taking on the whining tone of someone who'd been caught and was looking for sympathy rather than accepting responsibility. "Curtis knows things about my past, about Tommy's father, about mistakes I made before we met. He's been using that information to control me, and I was trapped in a situation I couldn't escape without destroying everything we'd built together." But the revelation about Tommy's paternity, rather than generating sympathy, only added another layer to my understanding of Lisa's capacity for deception and her willingness to use the most fundamental aspects of our relationship as tools for manipulation. "So Tommy isn't the son of some absent boyfriend from your past?" I said, the pieces of her elaborate fiction finally clicking into place. "Curtis is his biological father, which means you've been lying about your son's parentage, your mother's death, your Sunday activities, and your financial needs for the entire time we've been married." Lisa's silence confirmed what I'd already deduced from the evidence, and suddenly her defensive reactions to questions about Tommy's resemblance to unknown relatives, her anxiety about Curtis's interactions with our son, and her desperate need to maintain control over their Sunday visits all made perfect sense. She'd been managing a complex web of deception that went back to the very beginning of our relationship, and Curtis's leverage over her wasn't just romantic or financial, but included his parental rights to the child I'd been raising as my own son. The depth of Lisa's betrayal was staggering, but in that moment of complete revelation, I felt the kind of clarity that comes when every decision becomes obvious and inevitable. Here's what's going to happen, I told her, my voice carrying the same authority I used when directing complex construction projects that required precise coordination and flawless execution. You're going to pack whatever personal items you can fit in your car, and you're going to leave this house tonight. Tomorrow morning, my attorney will serve you with divorce papers and custody documents, and you're going to discover that adultery and conspiracy to commit murder have consequences that extend far beyond whatever criminal charges you might be facing. Lisa's desperate attempt to negotiate or find some compromise that would allow her to maintain access to the life she'd been betraying revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of the situation she'd created through her choices. "What about Tommy?" she asked, apparently still believing that her maternal relationship would provide leverage in our negotiations. "You can't just take away a child from his mother over mistakes that don't really involve him." But Lisa had made Tommy a central participant in her deception for years, and her willingness to expose him to Curtis and the dangerous environment of their criminal activities had eliminated any presumption that her maternal instincts were stronger than her selfish desires. "Tommy is going to stay with the parent who didn't train him to lie to authorities, steal money, or spend time with convicted felons," I replied. "And when he's old enough to understand the choices you made, he'll decide for himself whether he wants any relationship with someone who was willing to plan his adoptive father's murder for financial gain." The legal proceedings that followed moved with the kind of efficiency that comes when one party has overwhelming evidence and the other party has no defensible position. And within 6 months, Curtis was beginning a 25-year prison sentence for multiple counts of extortion, conspiracy, and attempted murder, while Lisa was facing her own criminal charges along with the complete loss of her parental rights and any claim to our family's assets. The investigation into their activities had uncovered additional victims and crimes that ensured Curtis would never again have the opportunity to prey on vulnerable people, and Lisa's cooperation with prosecutors hadn't been sufficient to earn her any meaningful reduction in her own legal consequences. But more satisfying than the legal victory was the knowledge that Tommy was now protected from the toxic influence of people who'd been willing to use him as a tool in their manipulation schemes, and that he would grow up with accurate information about his parentage and the circumstances that had led to our family's reconfiguration. At 9 years old, he was resilient enough to adapt to our new situation, and with therapy and honest communication, he was already beginning to understand that sometimes adults make bad choices that require other adults to take protective action. The house on Maple Street was eventually demolished as part of a neighborhood revitalization project, and Helen Martinez was relocated to a supervised care facility where she could receive appropriate treatment for the addiction and mental health issues that had made her vulnerable to Curtis's control. Lisa's mother was actually grateful for the intervention that had ended her captivity, and she provided testimony that helped ensure Curtis received the maximum possible sentence for his crimes. 6 months after Lisa moved out of our house, Tommy and I had established new routines that included honest Sunday activities like hiking, fishing, and visiting actual recreational locations instead of maintaining elaborate deceptions. He'd stopped asking about his mother's whereabouts or when she might be coming home, and while he still had occasional questions about why our family had changed so dramatically, he seemed to understand that some people make choices that have permanent consequences. Standing in our backyard on a Saturday morning, watching Tommy play with the dog we'd adopted from the animal shelter, I felt the kind of satisfaction that comes from successfully completing a complex demolition and rebuilding project. The foundation of our family had required complete reconstruction, but what we'd built in place of Lisa's deception was stronger and more honest than what had existed before. Curtis Brennan had learned that preying on people requires correctly assessing their capacity for retaliation, and Lisa had discovered that betrayal, theft, and conspiracy have consequences that extend far beyond whatever short-term benefits they might provide. Some men might have chosen forgiveness or reconciliation, might have tried to rebuild trust and repair the damage caused by their wife's deception and planned murder. But forgiveness requires remorse from the person being forgiven, and Lisa's primary regret seemed to be getting caught rather than the choices she'd made that had destroyed our family. Curtis had spent his adult life believing that intimidation and manipulation were sufficient to control the people around him. and discovering otherwise had cost him his freedom and his future. As for Tommy and me, we were building something new on the solid ground that remained after clearing away the lies and deception that had contaminated our previous life. It wasn't the family I'd originally planned, but it was honest and stable and built on the kind of foundation that could support whatever challenges the future might bring. And sometimes, when you discover that the structure you've been living in is fundamentally unsound, the best option is complete demolition followed by careful reconstruction using materials you can trust to last.